Hey everybody, and welcome to the Kodakery. This is Kodak's podcast where we interview creative people about their contributions to film, art, and science. I'm Megan.
And I'm Josh.
And today's episode is a special one. It takes a lot of people to make a motion picture, and it takes a lot of companies working together to create a movie. And in this case, we're going to discuss the journey that it took to make Quentin Tarantino's Hateful Eight. It's rare that a single artist can motivate an industry to rally behind a project or artistic vision, and in the case of Quentin Tarantino's Hateful Eight, that's exactly what happened. We're going to talk to some of the major players who made Hateful Eight possible today. Our first guest is Bob Harvey from Panavision, so let's jump into the Kodakery and talk with Bob.
Today, Bob Harvey from Panavision is joining us to talk more about how the Hateful Eight came to light and using Ultra Panavision to capture the film. Bob, welcome.
Well, thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. So first, Bob, why don't we start out with actually telling our audience a little bit about Panavision? I mean, it takes a village, as they say, to make anything good, and a movie definitely has a lot of parts and pieces and contributors. And Panavision is a storied company with a history deep into Hollywood. So could you tell us a little bit about Panavision?
Sure. Well, we were founded in 1954. That's a long time ago, and we started out making projection lenses for CinemaScope. CinemaScope was a Bosch and Loam process licensed by 20th Century Fox, and we made, I think it was 10,000 sets of projection lenses and sold them. And Gottschalk and his crew, Gottschalk was the founder, sat with this pile of money and said, what do we do now? And they decided to go into designing and manufacturing anamorphic taking lenses. We designed 4 lenses versus the CinemaScope 1 lens. We designed it faster so you didn't need as much lighting, and it took off. And filmed in Panavision literally means filmed in anamorphic Panavision lenses. We moved into cameras when we bought the MGM camera department. I believe that was probably around 1960 maybe. Before that, we were making large format lenses, which ultimately became Ultra Panavision. They were used on Ben-Hur and movies like that. When we went into the camera business, we decided to lease rather than sell because it was obvious if you sell it, you're out of business after that. And moving into the 70s, we designed the Panaflex, which was a very small sync sound camera. Spielberg talked about it as being a real breakthrough. On Sugarland Express, for instance, he could fit it inside the car and it was still sync sound. And, moving into the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, in 2000, we developed some digital cameras in conjunction with Sony, and today we're still developing new anamorphic lenses and technology. That's it in a nutshell. I would guess most of your listeners are familiar with us as they are with Kodak. And next question.
All right. So in the case of the Hateful Eight, Ultra Panavision is what really captured the imagination of the filmmakers. So can you tell us what Ultra Panavision is and when it was used last?
Well, Ultra Panavision is anamorphic 65 millimeter. It has an aspect ratio of 276:1 versus normal anamorphic 35, which is 235 and 240:1. So it's really wider, but it has all of the attributes of anamorphic, shallower depth of field, combined with 70 millimeter, creates a real different feel than 35 millimeter anamorphic, and certainly 35 millimeter spherical. The history of Ultra Panavision, the lenses were developed as early as 1956. They were used on Ben-Hur, which had an aspect ratio of 2.76:1 in the original format that was released on the road shows. Mad, 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 Mad World. What a lot of people don't realize, on How the West Was Won, which was a Cinerama movie, they did the railroad sequence where the guy falls into the cactus in Ultra Panavision. So our lenses with that aspect ratio was used on several Cinerama movies. And the last time it was used was on a movie called Khartoum with Charlton Heston in 1966. It was really used as something to bring people back into the theaters. It was an ultra widescreen experience, and of course, in those days, the moguls were worried about television taking over the world, and they were looking at all sorts of ways to bring people back into the theater. It was only used on 10 films, Hateful Eight being the 11th.
Okay. So it is really rare to see it used. I mean, not just for time, but just in general. It's never been used that often.
Well, it was difficult in those days to project. It took special projection lenses. The normal was spherical 70 millimeter. Lawrence of Arabia, West Side Story, Exodus were spherical, whereas, and the aspect ratio was completely different. It wasn't as wide. It was a large format. I think it was, I'm not sure of this, 210:1, something like that. This was 2.76:1.
Okay.
Which made a difference.
So this is really the widest of the widescreen.
Yes. It's as wide as Cinerama.
Okay.
Yes.
And did they need special theaters, like curved screens or anything like that, or was it?
No, on the Cinerama screen was a curved screen. You could show it on either.
Okay.
It was, obviously road shows were, once they got off the road and they were taken into regular theaters, they had to do some formatting to show it. But it all worked out. I mean, Mad, Mad, Mad World was shown in lots of theaters after the road show, for instance. And people who knew what the road show version looked like certainly would have noticed the difference. But it was a different experience. What can I tell you?
Right.
And
right.
watching it on television, it's a different experience.
Yeah. And so are there other than the wide, like obviously the widest of the widescreen and being able to capture like already in the Hateful Eight, the trailers with the the snowy mountains and the beautiful vistas and everything, is there other benefits to shooting in Ultra Panavision, and also does that bring other challenges?
All I can say is I saw a screening of it at the DGA where it was projected in 70 millimeter anamorphic. When the curtain opened, and it kept opening, and it kept opening, there were murmurs in the audience. Now remember, it was the DGA, and it was a special screening, and it was industry people. But the words overture came up, and they had a bit of a laugh at that, because that's like the old days.
Right.
As the sequence opened, as it dissolved into the movie, and you saw that range of mountains and the little stagecoach driving in the middle, there were gasps. I mean, quite literally, people were taken back and started to applaud.
That's awesome.
Now, last night I went to the movies to see Bridge of Spies, and I saw a Hateful Eight trailer. It's just too bad that everybody can't experience what we did in that screening, and certainly a lot of people will be able to. The road show is going to last for a couple of weeks, and then I'm sure as the thing is released into regular theaters, the road show version will still be projected and shown. That's the way people want to see this movie. It's gorgeous. It was a tremendous undertaking on the part of Panavision and Photochem and Kodak and everybody else involved, but it's almost sacrilegious if you're in this industry and you don't make an effort to see it projected that way.
Wow. So that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is how did Quentin Tarantino and the filmmakers choose Ultra Panavision? Was that something they came to you and asked for, or was it something that you took to them? And how did that come about?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Quentin always knew that he wanted to shoot it in 70 millimeter. And incidentally, we do a lot of 70 millimeter spherical. The Master was 70 millimeter, among other movies recently. So our 70 millimeter equipment, lenses and cameras, are going out, as I'm sure you know, being from Kodak. 70 millimeter film is not dead, any more than 35 millimeter film is dead. But Quentin wanted something special, and decided that's how he wanted to do it. He collaborated with Bob Richardson, who he came here and had a conversation with us, and Dan Suzuki, our vice president of optical engineering, and Dan showed him the Ultra Panavision lenses that we had in the box in the back. I think there was, again, I may be wrong, and don't write in because, I'm not the brightest peg around. I think there were 16 lenses and several zooms. Bob told Quentin about it. Quentin rented, from what I understand, actually Quentin said it, the night before he came here, he'd watched the Battle of the Bulge, which was a movie back from the 60s that was shot in Ultra Panavision. He came in and said, this is how we're doing it. It was magnificent, and looked at Dan Suzuki and said, any problem? And of course, Dan's famous for saying, no problem. And I kicked him. Nobody saw that. He then, Dan then proceeded to tear the lenses apart and put them back together and, literally unfroze some of them. Richardson walked by, a little side note, we have a display case by our theater with our Academy Awards and our Emmys and some old museum quality lenses, one of which was used for the Mirage sequence in Lawrence of Arabia, and has never been used since. But there were also some old prism lenses and auto panatars in the case. And Richardson noticed two of them that he liked the looks of and said, why don't you pull those out too? I'd like to use them. These were lenses that truly were on the chariot race in Ben-Hur. That's what they had been used for, among other things. I mean, obviously, those lenses were used on the Ultra Panavision shows. Dan pulled them and, as I say, tore them down, put new screws in them. In some cases, we had to sleeve some lenses, and got them ready for use. And at the same time, we were rejuvenating our 65 millimeter Panaflex cameras along with our high-speed 65 millimeter cameras, which, they were used regularly. That wasn't as big a deal as obviously getting the lenses back together. And we were given a time frame, and we were ready. Richardson took them to Telluride, tested them with Quentin, brought the tests back. We looked at the tests on our screen, then we went over to, we went to the Pantages and looked at it on their screen, on their 70 millimeter projectors, and then to the DGA, and it looked great. It was just breathtaking. And we knew we could do it. And that's how they decided to use it.
That's fantastic.
It must have been exciting.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah. It really was.
I'm a huge Western fan and a Tarantino fan, so the more you're talking about this, I feel like I should just go get in line right now to see this movie. So cool to hear how you're able to restore the lenses, but then also just the little bits of like the actual lenses from Ben-Hur were used in this movie, and that tie to cinema history. It's really exciting. And you also created some additional magazines, correct? So that Quentin could do longer takes and shoot more film at a time?
Well, you see, I'm going to jump up and down and beat my chest on that one, along with Jim Rodebush. I'm a big fan of Quentin's, and I can remember the one thing that stuck out in my mind was the opening sequence in *Inglourious Bastards*, where the camera went from Christopher Waltz speaking with the three people down to the floor, then back up to him, then down to the floor, very patiently taking lots of time to set up what was going on. Of course, there were people hidden below the floorboard. And I mentioned to Quentin, you like long takes. Maybe we can do something about that. John Rodriguez, who was design engineering, cringed when I said it. But I looked at John, I said, what about a 2,000-foot mag for an extra long take? Well, building a mag, right away, Quentin said, yeah, I need that. Building a mag is a real engineering feat in itself. You talk about displacement, you talk about torque and things like that, so that the film doesn't rip, and it's got to let enough film out so that at 24 frames a second there aren't any problems. Add to that the added weight of 65 millimeter film that you're familiar with, and it's a real undertaking. The guys did it. They built 3 2,000-foot mags. They were ready in time, and they were used in scenes in the movie. And I might add, that's what we do. It's about making movies, right. And this was movie making, and we were thrilled to be part of this and able to do it, able to come through.
Can you explain to maybe somebody who doesn't know what a magazine is a little bit more about it?
A magazine is what sits on the camera, whether it's the rear of the camera or the top of the camera, and feeds. That's where the load of film goes in. It goes into it, and then it's fed into the camera gate movement. You've heard them yell, check the gate. Goes through that, wiggles around through the movement, and then comes out on another end into the take-up reel inside the magazine, and it does that 24 times a second, unless you're shooting high speed, then it's obviously more, and it's very precision. I mean, it's got to be, right. Otherwise you can't shoot.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what Kodak is. Kodak's known for making the film that goes through that.
Yep.
Yeah.
You mentioned just a few minutes ago, and we wholeheartedly agree that film is not dead, and film has actually had a really, really good year this year. I mean, some of the biggest movies of the year, Star Wars, The Hateful Eight, Jurassic World, all shot on film. Have you seen, just in terms of the Ultra Panavision, I mean, do you think this is something that another filmmaker is going to pick up once they see this movie? And has there been, I know you probably can't talk about if there is, but has there been interest in a general sense from filmmakers about it?
The lenses went out on another movie about 6 days after Hateful Eight wrapped.
Wow.
That's great. So,
and we've got, after the screening, I received 6 or 7 calls about the, in quote, Richardson lenses. However, they are working on a movie right now.
Cool.
I'll use a dirty word. It happens to be on a digital movie, but it's these lenses that were used. And we were told by one of the producers they had never seen a better looking digital picture than what they saw with these lenses.
That's great, yeah. And does it change the capture at all, putting the lenses on a digital camera versus film? I mean, I know film and digital have inherently different qualities in terms of the image and everything, but just, do you have to do anything different to the lenses? Does it change the way that the capture happens, or is it just you plug and play and you're capturing in that same widescreen that you would on film?
Well, you're capturing in the same wide screen if you're using a 65 millimeter chip. I mean, obviously, it depends on the chip.
Right.
This happens, it's the Area 65 that they released. That, by the way, all of the movies that, almost all of the movies that the Area 65 was involved with used our lenses, whether it be the Primo 70s or the Ultra Panavision or the spherical Panavision 70s, the lenses are the key.
Right.
And as you probably know, older lenses are far more popular than brand new ones that, they'll burn your eyes if you look at them too closely. And I think that's one of the reasons why you and I can both agree film is not even close to being dead. The 10 poles this year were shot on film. The Bond movie was on film anamorphic. Star Wars was film anamorphic. Mission Impossible was film anamorphic. And it goes on and on and on. It's very much like vinyl records coming back because the quality is there, and the kids want to use film. Kids coming out of film school talk about using film today.
That's great.
Right. Yeah. We're very happy to hear that. So Bob, this has been great. I mean, we really appreciate you joining us for this segment on the show, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future, hopefully about another project.
Well, you guys keep up the good work, will you? Because, our film cameras are nothing without you.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bob.
My pleasure. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Our second guest on the Kodakery is Michael Broderson from Photochem. So let's jump into the Kodakery and talk with Michael.
All right, joining us now in the Kodakery is Michael Broderson from Photochem. And Photochem is another critical element in the making of the Hateful Eight. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
No problem.
So Mike, could you tell us a little bit about Photochem, what Photochem is, a little of the history of the company?
Sure. Photochem is basically a full-service post-production company. So we do everything from the developing and processing of the original image, whether it's film or digital, to the end result, which is what you see on the screen in either a digital projection or a film projection, and sort of everything in between through the editorial, color, and audio processes that it requires after shooting and editing, essentially.
So a director or a producer works with Photochem on a project and sees it all the way through, basically?
Yeah, basically we work with, a variety of folks, I think, directors, producers, cinematographers, and we provide the ancillary services, essentially, to help people get their creativity, their creative vision complete. And, we can start as early as, say, the editorial process or the production process, where we set up office space and editorial environments for the editors to work in, and through the creative aspects of post-production, which would be audio mixing and great color grading the film, and the visual effects and the compositing and getting everything looking, takes sometimes a year or more to do that part of the process after shooting. So we are kind of the guiding force or the resource pool, I guess, for these for our creative clients.
And you guys are involved in all kinds of projects, right? Could you mention maybe a couple of the bigger things that you've been involved with over the last year, just to give people a flavor?
Sure. I mean, well, being one of the last or at least even the largest film lab and a full service film lab, we're doing all these different large format shows. So we get to work with some pretty great people. Like we worked on Interstellar with Christopher Nolan, and Inherent Vice with Paul Thomas Anderson. So these guys, really push the boundaries of how to use film in large formats. And we also work on some restoration projects of some pretty well-known films. So we'll take and restore library work like The Sound of Music and My Fair Lady and It's a Bad Man, Mad World, and we'll restore those to new HD or 4K versions for re-release. Some current technology and the way people are mixing these mediums, mixing film and mixing digital. We did a bunch of work on Steve Jobs, the recent film with Danny Boyle, who shot 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, and Alexa for each decade of the show, of each decade of Steve Jobs' life. So basically, we take these different formats and we help him have a workflow for the front end during production that makes editorial and that production stage seamless. We finished San Andreas, which is pretty big all digitally shot show, and then we work on some TV shows like Homeland, The Nick, Better Call Saul, and one of the interesting things between television and feature work is that because the camera technologies, which used to be very different from TV and feature work, are now everybody's using the same camera technology. So the workflows are becoming very similar, as is the content between feature work and television work. So that's some of the stuff we've been doing.
Nice. I love many of those things that you just listed.
Me too. Me too.
So can you give our listeners a little bit? You mentioned you're one of the last kind of full service labs. The photochemical process. I mean, that used to be how all films were made, but now it's a a lot of films are projected digitally, shot digitally, and it's really there's a lot of choice for the artist. And the photochemical process is something that I think people don't really know about that much anymore. So could you talk a little bit about what that means and how it impacts how a film is made?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the photochemical process, actually any creative process, whether it's photochemical or digital, we'll start with the cinematographer and their choice of, in the case of film, their choice of film stock and film formats, whether it's 16, 35, 65 millimeter, and the lens choices. And that's really where the look and the thought process of the look begins. From the lab standpoint, there used to be a lot of stuff that you could bake in, but, basically the options are just normal developing from the negative. You can push or overdevelop the negative, and that can be done to compensate for underexposure or intentional underexposure. You can pull it, which is basically underdeveloping it, for overexposed or intentionally overexposed neg. We used to do things like skip bleach, a lot, where and you can do that on the negative, or you could do that on the inner negative, or any step of that chemical process, and that would bake in this skip bleached look, where you reduce saturation and you increase contrast. Most of that kind of thing is done in the digital intermediate now. Basic way to think of what can be created in a lab, you have the original negative from the camera. From that original negative, through a process on a printer, you can make an inner positive, which is a positive image on sort of negative-like stock, and that becomes a protection element. And from that inner positive, you can make an inner negative, or it's commonly called a dupe neg. And that dupe negative is sort of, or is close to identical as the original negative, and you can use that for making prints. And that really is just to protect that original element. If you're making thousands of prints or hundreds of prints, you don't want to necessarily put your original camera negative up on that, process of printing over and over again. You could damage it. So you make a dupe neg, and in terms of prints, there's 3 general types of prints that you can make. A check print, which is just to make sure everything's good. An answer print, which has gone through some type of color timing process, and then eventually the release print, which is after all the final choices are made, you make a release print. What happened after digital intermediate became the common standard is that you would take a bunch of digital files, 2K files or 4K files, and you would do a film out. So we film out to an intermediate stock, a brand new negative, and use that negative in place of what used to be original or dupe or a cut negative. So that's the basics of the chemical process and what the lab can do.
So basically, a director comes to you with a final product, looks at this check print, and then they say, based on what they see there, then they make a decision on how to process it?
Yeah. When there's a sort of an initial color decision that's made by the folks in the lab that say, hey, this based on the gray charts, based on color charts, this is where we think they want it, and then you can go from there to fine tune, and when cut negative, when they would actually cut negative, which some of our film clients still do, it still happens, but it used to be the standard. They would go each cut and make very specific light changes at each cut, and then that would be the process of making a final print. That doesn't happen too much anymore. It's more relegated to the digital intermediate process. But those changes are made based on that initial print, essentially.
Mike, just to be sure that our audience is clear on all the terms you're using, could you explain what a digital intermediate is?
Sure. Digital intermediate is basically, I guess the best way to think of it is if you look back at the way films used to be made as a standard, you would shoot a bunch of rolls of film. You would decide which shots that you liked. You'd go back to that original film and you'd cut out the pieces that you wanted to keep, and you'd splice those back together into your final roll. You would edit on a flatbed with a check print, and you would go back to that film and cut the film. When scanning negative became good enough, And it really started with visual effects, where you would scan a shot and do computer graphics on it, computer effects, and you would refilm that out to a new piece of negative and then use that in place. It became a mixture of cutting original negative and cutting in those visual effects back to that negative. When scanning got faster and more common, people just started scanning everything. So you would scan every shot. Instead of cutting that shot out of the negative, you'd locate that shot, scan it in at high resolution, and basically you'd have everything in a high-resolution digital format. And then you would cut back together that stuff in a digital intermediate system.
Okay.
And then you would do the entire thing digitally on a projector, on a digital projector, and then film it all out at the end. And that process was called digital intermediates.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Hateful Eight, there was obviously the whole idea of the roadshow, capturing the movie in Ultra Panavision, 70 millimeter, and then projecting it in 70 millimeter across the country. Can you talk a little bit about Photochem's role in that and the challenges challenges and excitement of kind of reviving that technology?
Sure. Well, I think I can kind of divide it up into two parts. And really, the beginning was just the production portion of it, where we've worked in this format before in a couple ways. We did some remastering for a movie called Cartoon and Mad, Mad, Mad World, and these were both shot in that Ultra Panavision format, so we had some experience, but we had never really done it from scratch. So some of the things, and they were really pushing the format in terms of, Quentin and Bob, they were really pushing the format in terms of what they wanted it to do. So they had created some larger magazines, and, Panavision did quite a bit of work with this to create larger rolls. So we had to figure out how to make sure large 70 millimeter rolls worked on our equipment. So our transfer machine that did the dailies transfers, we had to make sure that these big giant rolls were okay on these machines, and some types of modifications were made to some of our lab machines and our telecine machines. We had to make sure that the 65 millimeter negative and editorial dailies process, which was done on a machine called a Millennium, that the color that resulted from this Avid media that we created, this digital editorial media we created, looked the same as a film print. So we had to use our color science and make sure that the digital image that the editors were going to be looking at throughout this editorial process were the same as what they'd get on the end result in a film print, because that is the ultimate deliverable, is a film print, is what they considered their gold standard for delivery. There was a lot of color science involved. We printed dailies, and on top of that, so printing dailies, I can give you a little bit of background on that. Printing every roll of film to see in a projected way, that is not a standard anymore. That used to be the standard when that was the best way to see things, but now most people are transferring the film and looking at it digitally. So we printed everything, in this case, for dailies. They cut those prints, and then we had to make sure it would sync back up to audio. So we had to do a lot of work with tools. There was a tool that we resurrected out of the Academy warehouse, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences warehouse, had a flatbed called a Prevost. And this is something that had been used for years, and we took that out of the warehouse and resurrected it mechanically, and we combined it with some audio technology called a DV40 to help their editors sync to these prints. So they took cut prints, they took the audio, and they built basically synced rolls to send to Telluride, and then ultimately when they were here in L.A., sent them to L.A. so that the production crew could watch synced print dailies.
Wow.
And that was very important to them. So there was a lot of challenges around that. Obviously, the lenses and the maintenance of the 70 millimeter projectors was something that was, when you're dealing with that much footage, you have to keep these systems up. And basically, just the general amount of footage and the prints needed in this challenging time frame was some of that. So and then the other half, I think, would be what you asked about was the projection and the distribution of this kind of roadshow, right? And really, that's a really important collaboration between Kodak, Panavision, Boston Light and Sound, Photochem. We're all providing really important components to this process that, it couldn't be done without any of these key players. And I think from our standpoint, we're, making the prints and making those prints as good as possible according to how the creative people on the show wanted them. Bob Richardson and Quentin Tarantino wanted, we created this look and this thing that they were happy with. And these prints have to be very consistent. So all of the prints that are going to all the theaters, we made the prints. And then Boston Light and Sound is preparing all the projection and theaters and sound for all the theaters.
Wow.
And Panavision's providing those lenses and their expertise. So it really is a collaboration between all these companies.
Right. And to see that the industry come together like this and rally around to try to bring this artistic vision to moviegoers has been really exciting for us. And then just to hear you talk about how you're like literally resurrecting things from a museum. I mean, that must have been a great opportunity to almost rediscover kind of some of, the history of Hollywood and how things used to be done and all that kind of stuff. That's really cool.
It's pretty neat, yeah, and it really helps you get in the spirit of the filmmaker's vision and what they're trying to accomplish. And there's, we could talk for hours about, even just that stuff. So it's pretty interesting.
Right, and so in the process of the Hateful Eight, you mentioned, we've talked with Bob at Panavision, and I mean, how early on in the process did they come to you and bring you guys in to talk about, the vision for this, the movie and then also the projection?
Very early. I mean, I think before they even knew they could do what they wanted to do, they had to find a film lab and post house that could even do that work. So they came to us and said, hey, can you guys work in this format and, at this scale? And, it was one of the very first things after I think they found the lenses and got this great idea. The first thing they said is, hey, can we even do this? In much the way I'm sure they came to Kodak and said, hey, do we even have this film available?
Right.
So it was very early in the process.
That's fantastic. It's been, we think, we're excited about the year in film. There's been a lot of big movies shot on film. From your point of view, I mean, have you guys seen a lot of interest in film this year? How coming through the lab?
Yes, I think a lot of people are, there's a lot of people that really like not only the look, but the process of shooting in film. And, that really is a very subtle and layered conversation that, you could talk about for a long time, and there's a lot of angles to it. But I think in general, people really appreciate the history and the legacy and the technology of film and the artistry of it. And I'm sure when you spoke with Tacita and some of the other previous discussions you've had, people consider it an art form and a medium.
Yeah.
And that's how they like to work and think of it. So there's still a tremendous amount of interest and love for that medium.
Yep. Yeah. And that is definitely, we've heard that now in a couple of different episodes where people talk about it as a medium and as their chosen medium. There definitely is a lot of passion for it, which we're very thankful for. And you just gave me an idea for another episode as you were just talking through there. So that's so we really appreciate you joining us, and we're really excited to see the Hateful Eight and for your contribution to it and talking about this. And I would love to, like I said, maybe connect again for another episode in the future.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for including us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.
It is a great satisfaction to be able to speak to you through the medium of this wonderful invention.